Welcome all to this belated, supersized season finale of Profane Humanities podcast. Why a season finale? Well, partly because I need a break. The pandemic has forced me to focus my career in other areas, and it's proving a bit of a challenge, in case you hadn't noticed, to stay on top of the podcast with work changing and Egyptological things in general when I'm not really working much in that area at the moment. But fear not. Egyptology will always hold a special place in my heart, and you lovely folks who have downloaded several thousand episodes of this show guarantee that I will be back to either this show or making Egypt pop archaeology-based content somewhere else at some point, just not immediately. In this episode, I'm joined by my good pal Chris Kemble as we discuss various Egyptology-based things that surround Egypt-centered films and horror film in particular, including curses, labyrinthine pyramid structures, the Egyptian gods, space archaeology, and much, much more. So strap in, because this is a big old candid ride through the big pile of stones that is the pyramid from 2014. Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of Profane Humanities podcast. I am here today with my good friend Chris Kemble, horror
Hello.
Director, filmmaker extraordinaire. You may remember, long-time listeners may remember, that Chris and I had a good little chinwag about some mummy films a couple of years ago for a Halloween special. This, obviously, is not a Halloween special, but we will be discussing the movie Pyramid today.
Indeed.
So welcome, Chris. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to remind everyone out there what you're about?
Yeah, I am a filmmaker and a scriptwriter. And as you said, love of horror, feature films and things like that. That is a terrible introduction to myself, but...
Do you want to go again?
I'll fix that in post. That's fine.
No, that's my job now. So Chris edited a number of films that I've worked on, and whenever someone would say, we can fix that in post, I would see a little piece of his soul die.
Yeah, it's got the editor's eye twitch.
That's the one, isn't it? Yeah, the put upon editor. But you play it well.
Thanks, man.
No problem.
It's where I have to then go off and cry in another room.
That's
right, sounds great. Yeah. I'll be right back.
Oh dear, and that's me whenever I'm not doing a podcast. All right, so we're going to talk about the pyramid. We both watched it last night. We made a bunch of notes. I mean, you're the guest, sir, so I believe it's fair for you to start.
Okay, have you seen it before?
No.
So I have.
Oh.
Yeah, I saw it, I think, around when it came out.
Wow, okay.
And I will admit that when I first saw it, I was not that big of a fan.
Yeah.
I mean, the premise intrigued me. Ancient Egypt, horror film. And there's obviously, because there's so much mythology around it, and I guess, I don't know, is mythology the right word? Probably not. But just very intriguing and the potential there. And then I felt when I watched it that it was just a bit too B-movie and not... It was lacking something.
Yeah.
Especially as it's found footage and kind of wasn't really that different from things you've seen before, found footage style.
Yeah, absolutely. And a weird mix of found footage and not.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, I think, which for me is, so basically watching it again, I didn't really have massively high hopes.
Yeah.
But I will admit, I actually quite enjoyed it second time round. And in fact, third time round. Because I started watching it and then realised I wasn't making any notes. And I was like 2/3 of the way through. So I was like, I should go back. So I know what I'm talking about. I
did this exact same thing and just grabbed my phone and emailed myself my notes as I went along. Yeah, because I'm a pro like that. And,
oh, yeah.
I mean, I have to admit, and this was my summation afterwards as well, I enjoyed it, even whilst thinking it was quite a bad film.
Yeah.
Which I think was kind of my conclusion on the Tom Cruise The Mummy as well, in that I quite enjoyed it despite the fact I thought it was bad. I would say this is actually better than
I think so.
The Mummy.
Yeah, I felt the same. Kind of, I mean, they are very different, to be fair.
Yes.
They are, and they're not really trying to be the same thing. But yeah, a lot of things that I I mean, I don't really remember my experience of it the first time. I don't remember specific things when I first watched it. That this time I was like, oh, maybe that's not so bad. But I just, in general, I quite liked elements that we'll get into. But
yeah, so let's start with the premise. The setup is that archaeologists have discovered through the use of what they call space archaeology, and we would call, I don't know, GIS or remote sensing or what have you. Although remote sensing I've actually seen used in the context of psychic remote sensing as well, which is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about satellite imagery. And they discover another pyramid.
Space archaeology sounds better, by the way.
Space archaeology in space. And you've got
great title,
wouldn't it?
Career
That's
change,
it.
I think.
That's it. Not again. I can't afford another career change.
Ancient aliens.
Yeah, I was invited on that once,
And you didn't do it? What the hell?
I know, right? Sometimes I look back on the shows that I've turned down and I just think to myself, why the hell didn't you do that show? You should have just gone on it. It would have been a laugh, They would pay you money to sit there and take like, next time I'm just going to say yes. I don't care what it is. I'm just going to be like, yeah, sure. All right. I'll come on Ancient Aliens. Why not?
Exactly. Credibility be damned.
Yeah, well, it's done nothing for me thus far. So we get a team of intrepid explorers. They've discovered a pyramid, a three-sided pyramid. So there's something there. And they go in to excavate the pyramid. And, I guess we'll get into it here. So it's set in the time of the Arab Spring, which I thought was really interesting because having graduated during the Arab Spring, I remember the impact that had on Egyptology. And the first thing I thought when I saw the context of how this was set up was, oh, wow, how are they still digging? Because everyone I know was sent back during the uprisings in 2011, 2012.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah.
Which makes, was everyone sent away during the Arab Spring?
Yes.
Which makes sense, but it was an interesting it was an interesting motivation for why they are on their own and seemingly innocuous to what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely, but sets a great backdrop because you've got political instability, tensions are very high, and then everyone else has been pulled away and you are left at a site, which I think is great. That's a brilliant setup. And I thought the research at the outset of this, I don't know who did their Egyptology, and I haven't had time to look it up, so apologies if I happen to know you. But I thought actually the research they did on this film was up to a point, and you'll see the point when we get to it, up to a point actually not bad at all.
Okay. I mean, that's always same with The Mummy. That's always my big question to you is how authentic is it? Because it feels authentic when they're telling me all this stuff. I believe what they're saying, but then, movie magic.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, some liberties are taken, but a lot of the basic premise is okay. One thing I do always take exception to is the idea that every older, more established Egyptologist is somehow some dogmatic conservative that's not open to new techniques or change. It's just nonsense. There are a few people out there like that, of course, but for the most part, I think, quote unquote, space archaeology is accepted as a very viable and actually really exciting, addition to the field.
That was one of the notes that I made, which was because they refer to the journalist kind of calls him out on it and says, "Oh, are you one of those archaeologists that's stuck in time?" And I was wondering if that is actually a common thing, or whether or not the idea of using innovation is an insult.
Okay, so here's the thing with that is that it's actually a very well-known trope. It's a real stereotype within the field and around the field, and part of that emerges from the old. We had that kind of pre-millennial Egypt mania kind of thing going on with a lot of alternative archaeologists like Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval and Andrew Collins, and these characters saying, oh, they're going to find a chamber under the Sphinx and the pyramid's going to turn into a spaceship and Edgar Cayce is going to come out and reveal himself as a grey, or I don't know, some kind of bullshit. And during that period when those books were really popular, there were a few, but not many, but there were a few archaeologists going, this is nonsense, stop listening to them. And because of that, they decided...
Is there set in their ways?
Well, no, because...
Or is it a threat to their
No, it's not at all. This is the thing.
Okay.
Alternative archaeology is not a threat to traditional archaeology in any means, apart from in the fact that it's more popular in public eye than real archaeology, because real archaeology is, quite frankly, just painstaking and slow.
Yeah.
And it's just not exciting to watch. Whereas if someone comes along and goes, the pyramids were built by aliens, or the pyramids were built by an ancient civilization that spread, technological advancement throughout the world, and this one wore a fish on his head and he went around South America and he went around Egypt, and that's why they both got pyramids. People find that kind of shit exciting, basically, even though it's complete nonsense.
Well, that was one of my naive questions, which is obviously, you have pyramids in different cultures with no seeming crossover. Is that just purely coincidence?
It's coincidence in so much as that is the most stable tool structure you can build with primitive techniques. And
so I'm completely ignorant. That is what I assumed. I just
no. I mean that's the correct assumption. It's just it's the most stable way of building upwards. But pyramids in South America evolved very differently to pyramids in Egypt. The pyramids of Egypt are much older, way older. And very long story short, they evolved out of the idea of protecting the tomb. And at first, you would protect the grave. So you would, if you were buried in the desert, jackals will come along. This does actually tie into the film. Jackals will come along, they would dig up your grave and they would eat your carcass because they like the rotting flesh. It's just a peculiarity of their digestive system. And of course, that meant that the people watching this happen or seeing this occur started to associate the jackal with death, because they were always surrounding, the graves. And you see the development out of this notion of this jackal-headed deity, Anubis.
Yeah.
Anubis, it appears, was actually one of the, if not the major deity, particularly in the Giza area where the most famous pyramids are. And long story short, we see a technological evolution. And for anyone out there listening who doesn't believe in this, trust me when I say there is abundant evidence for this. Technological evolution of building techniques. First from a flat bench, which the Arabs call a mastaba, which is just the Arabic word for bench, basically. But that's what it looks like, a giant flat stone bench. And this is what they covered the graves with to stop both tomb robbers and jackals, desert jackals, from digging into the tomb, taking out the bodies, and then people running off with their goods. As we see, long story short again, as we see a centralization of government and authority and power, we see a centralization of wealth, a concentration of wealth being taken into the afterlife. And this all comes back to their beliefs as well. Taking wealth into the afterlife, doing burials this way, preserving the body, preserving the goods, belief in an afterlife leads to the notion that I have to protect my grave. If you have to protect your grave, then you're going to come up with more and more technological innovations in order to do that. And the pyramid, they thought at the time, was the security for beyond par excellence. Unfortunately, it wasn't, because it's a big freaking target. But yeah, we can see the evolution of it from the bench to a bench with more benches on it, which is the step pyramid of Djoser, as designed by Imhotep, as the record suggests. And then we have Seneferu coming along in the next dynasty, and he builds a ton of pyramids, and he gets them wrong. He gets the first two horribly wrong. One of them collapses on itself. One of them's too steep and it has to be built inwards, and we call that the bent pyramid. And then finally he builds the red pyramid. And we're like, hey, he got a pyramid right. It's the first true pyramid. And then the next generation come along, and King Khufu comes along and goes, I'm going to build the biggest freaking pyramid you've ever seen. And by this point, power is so centralized. He has the resources of an entire country to do so. And we actually have records of the pyramid builders. We've excavated their city. They had their own town. Records of their work and pay and, all of this stuff. So if anyone comes along and goes, no, they're called the pyramids, that's bullshit. We have the records. We know they were there. It's not a bugbear. I'm sorry. And rent.
Well, so tying back to the movie, they make a point of. So what I found really fascinating was this discovery of this new pyramid and the significance of it being a three-sided pyramid.
Three-sided pyramid. I remember. It's just a random memory of a Spider-Man cartoon I watched as a kid, and there were mummies. Spider-Man was fighting mummies. I think it was actually a Spider-Woman cartoon set in Egypt. But Spider-Man was a guest star. And he defeated the mummies by turning their pyramids into cubes with his webs. And they were like, they've discovered our weakness, abort. And all their pyramids fly off into space. And that This is
Wow.
why I'm an Egyptologist.
Yeah, that's the birth of ancient aliens right there.
A three-sided pyramid is, utterly unheard of, because it takes a certain kind of math and design to build a three-sided pyramid, not the way that they built pyramids, because they built them in blocks, not at angles. So the idea that this might belong to Akhenaten is an interesting one. I thought that was an interesting thread that they go in with, in that the father, played excellently by Dennis O'Hare.
Love him.
American Horror Story. I think he's the one that's saying he thinks it's Akhenaten. Is that right? And
they think that's what it is. They quite quickly decide that it isn't. But they're kind of, whether or not they're there looking for it, and then they find this instead, or whether or not they just kind of put 2 and 2 together and make 5. I'm not sure.
I think it's probably the latter, really, isn't it? Yeah. So they find the three-sided pyramid, and they think, and just to link that for the listener that isn't into Egyptology, the idea that it might be, and they didn't explain this in the film either, which I thought was quite interesting. Yeah,
there was a lot of reference to things that they don't overly explain.
Yeah.
Kind of almost throwaway, which for me helps with the authenticity.
Agreed. Yeah.
Because I'm like, okay, that's a thing. I mean, they could have just made the name up and I wouldn't know, because I'm an ignoramus, but
well, the thing is, like, Akhenaten was the heretic king, and he is notable because he did things differently. He changed the artistic canon, he changed design, he went into the middle of the desert and set up a brand new city, and he was just like, I think of Akhenaten as being the artist the pharaoh formerly known as Prince.
Interesting.
Do you know what I mean? He's like, I'm going to compose poetry, man, and I'm going to hang out all day.
So I didn't even realize, but then that does actually make sense why they might think a three-sided pyramid could be his, because interesting.
Yeah, he was a total rebel, and he wrote a lot of poetry. Some of it's quite good, actually. He was also, though, in theory, a bit of a fascist dictator, because he shut down all of the regular temples, forced people to stop praying to their own gods and worship his god. So, a bit of a double-edged sword, that one. It certainly wasn't the utopia of light and life that certain people would like to believe that the reign of Akhenaten was. It seems like there's potentially evidence that it was a bit of a police state, actually, in some ways.
There's the other interesting thing is how deep it's buried. So using their satellite imagery, they determined that it's about 600 feet.
Yeah.
Each side is about 600 feet.
Which makes it about 200 feet taller than the biggest pyramid, yeah.
But it's also buried.
Yeah.
Is the inference that it's exceptionally old? Too old to be Akhenaten? Or
she says that as well, doesn't she? She's like, there's no way that this could be Akhenaten's because it's buried too deep.
Yes, exactly. But then I was wondering, obviously, as the course of the movie goes on and you realise what it actually is, whether or not it's deliberately buried.
By the way, there will be spoilers. So if you haven't seen Pyramid, we're going to spoil the shit out of it for you.
Yeah, you can't discuss it without spoiling.
No, you can't. There's no spoiler-free discussion here.
Spoiler alert, it's not Akhenaten's pyramid.
That's right. Spoilers, it's not a spaceship, and Spider-Man doesn't cover it with webs. I'll fix that in post.
But yeah, I was wondering whether or not they'd actually built it deliberately and buried it. I deliberately built it downwards as opposed to built it upwards.
Oh, that's a really interesting point, actually, because they don't explore that.
No, they don't at all. But
so let's have a rundown of our cast so that people have an idea. If you've got no interest in watching this movie ever, here's the setup: father and daughter archaeology team. Father played by Dennis O'Hare from American Horror Story, being the old school archaeologist, and his daughter Nora being played by Ashley Hinshaw, who is doing her best Lara Croft, basically.
As you said, he's the kind of, he's not so much a curmudgeon, but he's kind of
a curmudgeon, isn't he?
Yeah, he's got the archaeology used to be about the digs and
dirt.
Now we've lost the raw sensation to all this technological mediation.
Yes.
I wrote that down.
Good quote.
Thanks.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, he does go along with it and he uses all the satellite imagery and draws all his conclusions from that. So
he does. Yeah. He's like, you kids and all your bullshit. I'm going to use this bullshit.
Yeah. Exactly.
And then we've got our media team, played by James Buckley as the cameraman, who's from In-Betweeners, as we'll know over here, although I'm not sure if those Americans. I'm not sure if they're familiar with The Inbetweeners. Did that get to America? I know it had a movie, but
Had 2 movies.
2 movies. Holy shit! I've not seen either of them.
I don't know.
I liked the show a lot.
Yeah, it's quintessentially English high school, though.
It really is, isn't it? I don't
so
see
how well that translates, but
I mean,
it is
arguably,
a slice of life.
Like Dennis O'Hare, in theory, is the biggest name in this, but he's not billed as the biggest name in this.
No.
Like James Buckley is billed as the biggest name in this, despite the fact that no one in the States will have ever heard of him, I don't think.
I do wonder, though, if that's because we're watching an English version of the film.
That's a very good point, actually. That's a very good point. I'm guessing Ashley Hinshaw was actually billed as the biggest star in this in the States. Probably. She probably is one of the 2 now. And then we have our intrepid reporter, Lois Lane style, played by Krista Nicola, Sunny. She was annoying.
Well, interesting. I thought they all were kind of annoying.
Let's not stop there, Paul.
But in their own way, and
all annoying.
I think maybe when I first watched it, I was like, "Oh man, all these people are annoying." Whereas watching it the second time, I was like, "Oh, interesting. They're all kind of annoying. I don't really like any of them." But then, without going in, because we'll get into it later, but I wonder how much that plays into the ending and, the sense of judgment. Because they talk about people being judged and things like that, whether or not, if they're all
looking for
jerks.
a pure soul.
Yeah, if they're all jerks, whether or not. Yeah.
Well, that's a big thing in horror, isn't it? Like, there is always a sin, and it's generally in horror the trope is that whoever didn't commit the sin gets to survive. Like, that was the stereotype we grew up with.
That's the final girl is always the virgin.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it's Nancy in Nightmare on Elm Street. It's Jamie Lee Curtis in Halloween.
Yeah. Neve Campbell in Scream.
It's a lot of horror was a moral lesson disguised as a scarefest, and this isn't really any different, I suppose, in that sense. It does follow those tropes, and of course we got as well. We shouldn't forget Zahir, played by Amir K, who is first victim.
He's also probably the most douchey.
He's definitely really douchey. I mean, they have this Mars rover which he controls, which he's using to spy on heroine at the beginning of the film while she's getting changed. And it's like, oh, that's super creepy and gratuitous.
Before you know they're an item.
Yeah. So he was a jerk. So maybe that's why he was the first to go.
This is it. But they don't make a big moral thing out of it.
No.
So I don't know whether or not that was the intention. But, James Buckley's character is quite cowardly.
He's really cowardly, yeah.
And, Dennis O'Hare is he's quite stuck in his ways and that kind of thing. He and the journalist butt heads quite a lot. She's kind of defensively panicky,
She's also overtly ambitious.
Yes.
Which I just got the impression that was meant to be her flaw, so to speak.
One of the things that I was unsure about was why they were there. So I know that they said, you agreed to us filming everything you do, but our archaeologist team don't seem like they really want the documentary team there.
It might be because they have to, because they're getting funding from a university. It has to be documented, or it might be that someone's made a deal with a documentary producer or network or something like that to do that. It's not. It might have been explained, and I've missed it. In fairness, they might have made some kind of. But yeah, it doesn't feel.
It wasn't a problem. It was something I noticed that It wasn't like he was. Because I can imagine an alternate version where Dennis O'Hare's character is really wanting to show off in front of the camera, and they actually make him look a bit of a douche, but they don't. He's very much. His character is kind of very much like, this is something I just have to get over with, so I can get back to what I actually want to do, which is archaeology. It was just interesting.
Good observation.
Interesting route to take these characters, but I guess that throws up, antagonism between the characters.
Of which there is quite a lot, because you have there's certainly there's an age versus youth thing and a little bit of a gender thing going on in this, I thought.
Yeah, But I also thought it turned them
on their heads.
A little bit. And there was no, interestingly, aside from the younger archaeologist and a tech guy being an item, there was no love interest, as it were. It wasn't like she and James Buckley were due to get together or anything like that. It just wasn't even on the cards,
No, it wasn't. And I'm glad that was the case, actually. I think that was to its credit.
It's kind of where because I don't, like I said, I don't remember what happened when I first watched it. I remember certain big twists and things like that, but it's where I thought it was going to go, and it just didn't, and I was quite glad that it didn't do that. Me
too. So, back to our...
Sorry, yes.
No. Back to our plot. Curse over the doorway. That was a little Egyptological note I wanted to pull out. A little bit of a thread there. Because that's become a bit of a trope itself, a bit of a stereotype, and it's based on an unverified, to my knowledge, news story that was spread at the time of the preparation for opening Tutankhamun's tomb. And it was widely reported by one of the papers who were really into the curse because, long story short, and I'm sure we've covered this before, there was an exclusive, I believe it was with the Times, between Lord Carnarvon and one of the major papers in London anyway, that all of the information about the tomb would go through them, which meant every other newspaper was scrabbling for something because they couldn't get news from the source. And so they ran with the curse story. After the first kind of bad thing happened, they just ran with the curse of the mummy. And it was reported at the time that they found an inscription which said, "Death will come on swift wings to he who enters this tomb," over the doorway to the tomb of King Tut. And we see a similar thing in this. Now, as a brief historical aside, it's later reported that whatever inscription was over the tomb fell off and or was destroyed. And it's actually very unclear as to whether it was completely at the time. I'm not clear on that, whether it was ever actually really there and documented as being there. I don't think it's in Howard Carter's notes. I think it comes from the newspapers. So that's an interesting thing because that's become such a trope that there will be a curse over a doorway.
Interesting. I always assumed it was a kind of, not an actual curse, but a thing to kind of ward off grave robbers.
It's a funny thing because a lot of, if not the majority of the inscriptions that we have addressing people coming to a tomb from ancient Egypt, there are a couple of curses. There are a couple in the record saying, if the God's punishment will come on you or what have you if you come to steal. But conversely, if you come to speak the name of the deceased, you will be blessed. So there wasn't this, we have this concept in the West now of this violation of sacred space, like something is taboo to even step through the threshold of. But that's quite a modern concept.
Interesting. I thought that would tie into, because you were saying, they built them as security. But I guess that was more, as you said, for jackals and desecration as opposed to
desecration and robbers. I mean, robbers were certainly not welcome, and you're very right. They did build pyramids to be secure, but it's also the case that that's not our understanding of how that space is quote unquote sacred is based on our modern interpretation of these ideas of thresholds between the sacred and the profane, and that's not necessarily really how the Egyptians treated space in that way.
So were they open to the general public then?
Generally speaking, there would be two separate bits or two separate sites, depending on how rich you were. And you would have a bit of a tomb or a site specifically where offerings would be made to the cult of the deceased. Because once you had passed on, basically, you became Aku, these spirits, excellent spirits of Ra, the spirits of the dead. And the Aku were worshipped as divine ancestors. And this is where we get the idea of ghosts as well, because they were thought to be present and able to see what the living were doing, and you would give offerings to them. And we have quite a good, strong tradition of this, particularly in the site of Deir el-Medina, which is the site of the tomb builders, because they were semi-elite and they were all literate. And we have really good records of how they lived. So cults of the deceased were very common. There were cults of the king and of the deceased king. Now, there's a bit of a, despite and kind of flying in the face of everything I just said about sacred space, there's a bit of a difference between Pharaoh and everyone else, because Pharaoh is God on earth. You don't generally mess with God on earth. But they do want you to make offerings for God on earth, even after he's passed. He wants his name spoken. This is why Ramesses blotted out most of the names on everyone else's architecture, because he wanted his name remembered. Because as long as your name's remembered, you are still alive. And quite literally, in some cases, that was believed. I'll shut up now. Sorry. Tangent.
No, so does that... the concept of an afterlife, do they go... Is it a place that they go to?
Yeah, so
which is what they reference in this film, but with Osiris. So is that, I mean, how does that play into, people speaking their name, keeping them alive kind of thing?
Well, yeah, it's a really good question. And it's kind of theologically complex, but basically you would go to an afterlife after judgment, and you would be in it's kind of the Egyptian version of Elysium, or the fields of Elysium.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, you would get to, it would be like this life. You'd get to do a lot of the same things, but a lot of the reason that there's depictions of people doing certain things, like things they enjoy, like hunting and fishing and, playing with their kids or whatever, is because they wanted to let the universe know, or let the gods know, that's what they enjoyed. And that's what they wanted to do in the next life.
Was it something to aspire to?
Yeah.
Such as, again, show my ignorance here, but like the Catholic view of, live your life well here and on this plane, and you will reap the benefits in heaven. I mean,
the Egyptians basically invented that.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church kind of ran with it. So yeah,
makes sense.
Yeah. It's totally a lot of that. I mean, the concept of the afterlife made Egyptian religion very popular, and made the Isis religion very popular. And when we see, in much later periods here, when we see the Isis, or the cult of Isis religion, spreading throughout the Mediterranean basin, it's the fact that it promises an afterlife to every social strata that makes it so appealing. So before that,
which I guess, is where then the judgment comes in.
Yeah, for sure. That's where judgment comes in. And that judgment was true for the dead from the very beginning, from what we can understand of Egyptian civilization. But, unless you were rich, unless you were noble, you didn't have the money for a tomb, or even probably understand what the Book of the Dead was, or what those spells were. I mean, this was what they considered secret knowledge. So, at the time. So that was a huge tangent just from a curse over a doorway, but I thought it was a really interesting trope that they picked that out in particular, because it ties into so much other stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it ties into, as you said, it ties into a lot of the kind of horror mythology around, the mummy and things like that. It's why those curses are intriguing. It's what made me want to see the film in the first place. It is kind of, the curse of the pyramids and stuff like that.
Yeah, for sure. And it plays off of that really well, doesn't it? And it's a compelling
now you've ruined
idea.
It for me, because you've told me that wasn't even a thing. So,
no, I'm not saying it's not a thing. No, I'm not saying it's not a thing. Let me backtrack a slight bit. It is a thing. And curses in Egypt were a thing, or rather fear of being cursed was definitely a thing. It didn't seem to be enough of a thing to deter grave robbery, because they did it. So en masse. So whether how literally everyone took that is very open to question, probably very individual. But to generalize, basically what I'm saying is we shouldn't generalize that every tomb had some kind of curse atop it. Like even with the Tutankhamun thing, that's in question whether there was an inscription there or not, and probably not. We know there are a couple. It's not unheard of, but it's not actually that common, is what I'm saying. And tombs aren't always things that are inviolate. They are sometimes things where there's a bit that's sacred, or there's a bit that's sacred's not even the right word. There's a bit that shouldn't be disturbed, because that's where the dead live.
Okay.
But there's also a bit where you'd come and you'd make offerings, like for the cult of the deceased, and you would like exactly like I say, you would leave them offerings and keep their name alive, and that's as important in many ways as leaving their shit alone. Yeah,
it's interesting because I think, realism aside, it does kind of make sense that there's a curse over this particular doorway, in the same way definitely. That in the original, I'm sorry, not the original, in the Brendan Fraser mummy, Imhotep's sarcophagus is cursed. Well, sorry, there is a curse on it, so that if you open it, you then.
It's a crazy decision on their part, I thought. Let's give him infinite power if he's ever woken up.
Yeah, that never made sense. That never made sense.
It's a very silly film.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sebast.
Yes. Sorry.
There's a load of cats down here. They look like Sphinx cats. They're evil. We'll come back to these guys. And they eat the douchebag. That's the first thing that happens, right?
Well,
sort of.
They lose their... So this
they
is
lose
what I
their
quite
rover.
liked.
Yeah.
They do a quick rover trip into the pyramid. And I can't remember why they do it now. Because they're told to leave.
They were worried about the poison gas. They're told to leave because of the uprising, which is accurate, really. And yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Why do they go in? Because they're there and they have all the equipment.
They're there. They have all the equipment. They don't want to leave without seeing. There was another reason, wasn't there? There was some reason they wanted to just look inside it with the rover, but they didn't want to necessarily step inside it because of the gas.
Yes.
Yeah. The first digger, he opens a thing and you see it in the trailer. Yeah. It's like this poison gas gets him and he's rummaging about.
Aspergillus.
Yeah.
Is what type of mold?
As they present it, yeah. There is precedent for that. There are definitely tombs with quite horrible molds in them that have been known to, or theoretically might have caused infections on certain individuals who have excavated them and potentially infected them and led to their death. It was something that Zahi Hawass, very famous Egyptian Egyptologist, used to talk about a lot. And it was the reason he gave for not shaving. He said, I don't shave before I go into a tomb because if I have a cut on my face and I get exposed to that fungus, I don't want to get an infection.
Interesting.
But he also wore an Indiana Jones hat, and I think that's the real reason he didn't shave. So he could be more,
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But then that kind of also, it's interesting because it inadvertently ties in with the sense of the curse. If you open the doorway and you suddenly get a cloud of skanky mold gas, you're going to get an infection and then potentially die. It looks like you've been cursed.
Totally.
Especially if you don't understand what's happening.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah, so they send the rover in.
Sorry, yes.
No, you rightly took us back to it, and then I took us away from it, I think. They send the rover in to have a look around, and then they lose contact with the rover, because of course they do.
Which I thought was then good motivation for them actually going in, because it is $3 million device.
Yeah.
How likely, they've got satellite imagery.
Mm-hmm.
They've got access to satellites doing this kind of stuff. How likely is it that a random archaeology team, I guess they're funded, but would have access to a NASA? They name NASA.
Well, this is interesting actually, because, and she mentions the SETI Foundation as well, which all of these parties have been involved at the Giza Plateau over the last 20 or so years. There have been little robots like that rover sent into shafts in pyramids with cameras to have a look around. There was a shaft discovered I think it was actually in the Great Pyramid, and a little rover was sent down, and I think there was a set of tunnels under the Sphinx that weirdly no one's talking about now very much, but there were some kind of, not necessarily man-made tunnels, but there were some, what do you call them? Caverns, potentially? Occlusions? I'm not sure. There was something down there. So these robots have been used, and there was a lot of fuss about them in the press at the time. It was part of that whole millennial Egyptomania stuff that happened. So how likely is it? There is precedent.
Okay.
Yeah, totally.
On the one hand, it seemed quite convenient, but on the other hand, it was kind of cool. I
liked it. I thought it looked like a cross between the Johnny Five from Short Circuit and WALL-E.
Yeah, it did.
And I was sad when it inevitably got trashed.
Yeah. But then I liked the fact that guy was freaking out a little bit.
Yeah.
And then was like, we've got to go get it. We know where it is. Let's just, I know that we have to leave because of the Arab Spring, but that's $3 million worth of equipment that I'm going to die if I don't get.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought that was pretty solid. The first two acts of this film, I think, are pretty solid, really.
It's interesting because when you watch horror films most of the time, it's like, oh, why would you go in there?
Yeah.
Why are you doing this? This is clearly a bad idea. And, objectively the same thing here, because something has destroyed that robot. But at the same time, my perception of, don't go in there, that's a terrible idea, is only because,
you're watching a horror movie.
Yeah, exactly. If you're an actual Egyptologist, you're not going to assume there's something horrible in a
Hell
pyramid,
no.
I would guess.
Honestly, if I was
I
there,
mean, you know something's there.
if I was there, I wouldn't care either way because I'm an idiot like that. And people who saw me break into abandoned churches as a kid, which is something I used to do a bit too often, would probably testify to the fact that if I were in that position, I would have gone in. And you wouldn't need to motivate me with a robot. If I found a 3-sided pyramid, I'm going in that fucking pyramid.
Yeah.
Without question. I don't care if I die in there. Like, I want to see what's in that pyramid. So, yeah, to me, that was a no-brainer. If I'd been working on that and excavated that, I'd be like, I am not going back to England before I go in that thing. I'm sorry.
Which I guess was their motivation as well.
Exactly. I thought everything about that was just like, yeah, completely legit.
I didn't. So when the soldier comes and tells them to leave before they go in.
Yeah, they call him Captain Egypt a lot, don't they? I think he's Corporal Shadid.
Shadid, yeah.
Yeah.
They have the tech guy and Shadid have a conversation which we don't get.
In Arabic, yes.
Yeah.
They do, yeah.
But I got the impression it was a kind of, we need to know what this is. This is really important. As an Egyptian, we should know what this is. Kind of thing. It was that kind of impression, I think, is what
I think that's a fair impression. I would like to know.
Which is why they get 2 hours.
Yeah. I gave up on Arabic. I was learning Arabic when I was doing Egyptology, and it was just all too much, and I had to just let it slip by. So I couldn't follow what they were.
Not that it's important, but it all fed into this kind of believable motivation as to why they're going inside what turns out to be a terrible idea.
A really terrible idea, yeah.
He uses a high tensile steel cable to keep track of their route, which makes sense to me. If you don't know where you're going, you don't want to get lost. This pyramid in particular is particularly labyrinthine, but how common is that? Were they deliberately built to be mazes?
Oh, there is a labyrinth underneath a pyramid that was never finished.
God, that's even more annoying. If you're in that maze and then it just stops. Great.
It's true.
Because, no real reason why. I'm just curious if that's something you would expect or whether or not this is. Because there's a lot of things that happen when they go into this pyramid. Unusual things that you're uncertain whether or not it's just... So, for example, when they hear Shadid calling,
yeah,
his voice seems to be coming from, is he to the left or is he to the right? It's kind of, I don't know, echo chambers and stuff like that. Things that can be explained away, but, they lose their bearings quite easily.
They really do. Yeah, they lose their bearings really easily. But the thing is, there is historical precedent for a labyrinthine structure because the structures themselves were designed to be slightly labyrinthine, certainly as the technology got better and time went on. There's something called the Southern Unfinished Pyramid, and it's in Saqqara. Mm-hmm. And it's from the Middle Kingdom, so it's quite a lot later than these ones. We're looking at about 1700 BC, something like that. And you can't really see the pyramid anymore. It's not really noticeable. But underground, it's got this incredibly complex substructure. And it's a labyrinth down there with like sliding portcullises and like just weird sideways doors and a maze of tunnels. And if you were in there, this is real Tomb Raider shit. If you had tried to break into that pyramid, you would get lost. That was the idea. And there were sandrolics used in certain tombs, and I'm going to be doing a special on tomb technology at some point in the future because I find that stuff really fascinating. But yeah, there is precedent for that. Like the more labyrinthine, the better kind of thing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But is that because, surely that's not helpful for if you're trying to get people to come and you wouldn't. Yeah. Okay. So, is it a bit like the maze outside Hampton Court Palace?
Just to clarify, like a pyramid, and I should have actually clarified this earlier, a pyramid built for a pharaoh isn't meant to be entered. They would have a separate offering temple.
Right. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, I should have clarified that at the start. Do over. A pyramid
we'll fix it in post, mate.
I'll fix that in post. A pyramid is not meant to be entered. A pyramid is meant to be sealed for eternity, and a separate holy site, so to speak, would be set up for the pharaoh. So that completely almost undoes everything I said before. But some tombs were designed that you would be entered. That's the main drive of the point I was trying to make. There's not this kind of idea of stepping beyond a line is violation. necessarily. It's just if I'm Pharaoh and I've got the country's weight in gold, then I don't want you coming in. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that makes sense. And then you got the cable, and
the cable snaps, and then they fall through a floor. Now, there's a thread to pull on here. Why the hell? You can tell these guys never played Tomb Raider or anything like that. Why, when they're walking on this really crazy floor that's cracking underneath them, and they're trying to get out of this chamber where the floor is falling in, why are they walking over the middle, the weakest point?
Just walk around the edge. You even see there's a little ledge.
There's a ledge. They could have just literally just on the ledge and just strolled out.
Panic.
I guess that's the only thing that can explain it. Because I was sitting there shouting at the television.
I mean, yeah. I thought that was done quite well, though. And, that's the thing.
You mean visually, or?
Yes. Sorry. Yes. When the floor collapses underneath them.
Right. Yeah. It does look good.
So the interesting thing that I found was they took a lot of kind of seemingly general conventions, and then put an ever so slight twist on them that made this pyramid an unusual draw. Right. So, for example, when they first enter, when they find Shorty, the robot, which I assume is because it looks like Short Circuit, there's the hole in the ceiling that they climb through, and then they find weapons and things like that they talk about offerings or an armory that was, but he makes the point that, they're typically left next to the grave.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of these kind of essentially conventions that then this pyramid, much like it being a three-sided pyramid, is turning on its head slightly.
Yeah.
So that gives it this certain sense of abnormality and therefore unease. Something is amiss. Finding that the weapons aren't ornamental, they seem to be used.
Yeah.
I thought that was all quite an interesting. It lends to that credibility and this air of mystery around it.
And at some point, I think I just reached a bit of a limit with it, because I was like, oh, okay, this is interesting. They've clearly done their homework and they want to show you that they've done their homework. But then there was enough of that for me to go, okay, but it's not going anywhere. You're not taking anywhere. Like I guess that's actually a really good example of it. It's like, well, okay, but why? Like, why was that up there? Why had that weapon been used? We never get resolution to those questions.
Yeah.
And we can make them up, knowing where the film goes to a degree. We can kind of make them up, but then
it's one of those things where you do wonder, as an outsider, whether or not you mentioned the first two acts are great, the third not so much, and objectively you wonder how much of it is a film of two halves where they're trying to be this interesting, subversive on these conventions kind of horror, but then also it needs to be slightly schlocky, and have these jump out scary moments, so we'll leave some of this. But then at the same time, it didn't matter too much to me, because it just helped to, it was world building as opposed to necessarily important. So
you could hand wave a lot of that as world building, and I'd be fine with that. I think if I were looking at it as a filmmaker and not an archaeologist, I would say, that's whatever, that's cool, that's fine.
This film is a documentary, but
that's the funny thing about it, though, is like they get so close with a lot of the stuff, but then they go into a weird space. So, like, for instance, when they come across, so they're lost in the pyramid by this point, we've established, and they've fallen through some holes, and one of them's been dragged away by hairless cats and like demon cats. And
I assumed it wasn't actually the demon cats that got him.
Oh, do you think it was the big bad? Yeah,
big bad.
That makes sense. Yeah, because there's no heart in your leg. Don't need that. Spoilers. 6-year-old film. Get over it. They come across this inscription later, and it's a very typical inscription of, and it even looks like, Ramses or one of the great kings smiting his enemies. Very typical list of the deeds of a king, of how many prisoners they have. They took great records of their victories. So many, in fact, so much so that they never lost a war, according to Egyptian records. That's how they get their records. They never lost a war. They just won battles increasingly closer to home. So, but that inscription is very standard. Like there's a dozen examples of it across museums all across the world. And it's weird to me that he, as an experienced Egyptologist, looks at that and is like weirded out, and he's like, "This is a warning." And it's like, no, it's not. Well, it's just a record of the.
That's
prisoners.
what I was wondering at, because the inscription he seems to be looking at, is that it's not hieroglyphic language.
No, it's just a record.
Yeah, it's pictographic records, right?
Yeah.
Which therefore, I mean, he's educated and experienced, but it's still subjective, right?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah.
So
within that context, you could probably argue that, I mean, I'm not sure where you would get warning from that, but you could argue that this is showing off the power of the king that's depicted, and there is a king depicted there.
Mm.
And in that sense, it would be a warning. If you were coming from Libya and it was a picture of hundreds of Libyans having their hands or other extremities chopped off, and the pharaoh is giant and smiting them all, then that's a warning to Libyans: don't come in here, and because we will F you up.
Yeah.
In that context, in a tomb, it made no sense to me for him to make that inference.
Okay. I mean,
so that was weird.
Is it after they're already lost and realise they're in hell?
I mean, pretty much. Yeah, it is.
I mean, because then I'd start reading everything as
a warning.
As a warning. Yeah.
This place is cursed. Yeah, totally. But I mean, it doesn't stop them from splitting the party later.
Yeah.
So yeah, diving back into the plot, they're totally lost in the pyramid. They're being picked off. We now know we're definitely in a Monster in the House movie.
Mm. Yeah, Shadid comes and he gets
killed,
pulled quite gruesomely, I thought.
He does get pulled quite gruesomely.
Interestingly, it's quite well done.
It was quite well done, and I think this is a good point to pull out the idea of the weird unevenness of the special effects in this film, because some of them are really quite good, I thought, and some of them are notably bad.
Okay.
So most of the special effects right up to the big bad are pretty decent, I thought. Like, not terrible at all.
I think the style helps.
Yeah.
You don't see very much. And
I mean,
what
you're
you do
much
see
more of an
is
expert on this.
Also, being found footage, it allows for the kind of blink and you miss it effects. And in fact, you see the big bad quite early on, but in the background, and you don't realize.
Yeah.
And so it allows for moments of quick fire, something flashes across the screen and, knocks the cameraman over or something like that. So you don't need to, because you don't have that gratuitous VFX shot. Yeah. You can get away with dodgier graphics because you can hide it in shadow as well, particularly in this film. And I actually thought the big bad, when they're using his night vision and things like that, I actually thought that stuff was all really good.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
It's right at the end when you kind of get right in your face, full frame kind of thing. Then it's like, okay, yeah, fine. It's cheap special effects. But then, it's a low budget movie. You're not watching, it's not The Mummy. And even that had kind of ropey special effects anyway. So
yeah, I mean, like for its day, they were amazing.
I meant the recent Mummy.
Oh, the recent Mummy. Yeah, actually, that did have some shonky effects, didn't it? Considering, I mean, this only had a estimated budget of $6.5 million, which is nothing.
Nothing. But then found footage doesn't really need a huge budget because you're using it. Arguably, it requires not more skill, a different kind of skill, but it requires a lot of skill to frame your shots believably. So you can make the most of those scares, those VFX shots without actually showing them. You just have to do it you can do it in a more interesting way. and because of your budget. I think, the Brendan Fraser mummy, the effects in that are, at the time they were really good, but then it's also, the whole film itself is slightly cartoony.
Yeah.
It's
totally.
not necessarily real world.
Yeah.
So when you see the slightly CGI mummy, you're kind of in the zone anyway. It doesn't really matter. There's this kind of level of humor throughout the film anyway.
This is true.
It's not as jarring. Whereas when you're watching something that's meant to be
Scary,
real life,
and it looks a bit cartoony. Yeah.
Well, especially with, and then this is kind of the pitfall of found footage. Is found footage is meant to be what you're seeing is actually real. It's not a movie. This is meant to be the actual thing. So then when you see something that then looks shonky, you're like, okay.
I can't help but feel that you saw too much of the big bad in a way.
Yeah.
This is something we should pull out as well, actually, because I personally, having studied people who reconstruct ancient Egyptian religion and worship those gods, I actually cringe a bit when I see an ancient Egyptian god used as a bad guy.
Spoiler alert. The bad guy is Anubis.
Yeah. So to me, that was a bit like, oh, that's. I know a lot of people that would consider that quite kind of offensive. Now, granted, that's not a majority reading. A majority reading of this would be, obscure Egyptian god that most people are only vaguely familiar with. So I obviously position differently to most people on that.
I would like to apologize to those people because I thought it was awesome. But only, in the same way that, I like watching a film where God is an arsehole,
right.
Because I quite liked I have to say I wasn't expecting it. I was expecting the Mummy or something like that, some kind of...
It's true, it is a twist. Plot twist.
Have this kind
it's an actual god.
Yeah, big god-like creature.
Yeah.
Being the bad guy. I was like, snap. Because it is... and I quite liked... the execution of it, fine. Perhaps dodgy VFX, but...
Did look a bit like Wile E. Coyote in CGI at points.
It did, but then, it's a jackal that walks with a humanoid body. I can
see what they were going for.
Is
for
quite
sure.
It never occurred to me, really, until I saw it.
Yeah.
Because you see the hieroglyphics and stuff like it's a man with a jackal's head, or, But then if you take a step back and think about it, that's actually quite monstrous.
Yeah.
It's one of those things where, this is a terrible reference now because I don't have any memory of what it is I'm referring to, but where they do what it would be like if Bowser was in real life or something like that, these or cartoony video characters, if what they'd actually look like.
As we saw with the recent hysteria surrounding Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yes, exactly.
People were like,
oh my god, this is monstrous. Because that cartoony thing is now gone, and not that the hieroglyphics were cartoony, they were very ordinary. But then, if you actually saw a man with a jackal's head, that would be terrifying. So I quite liked that angle of it. And I quite liked their explanation of it in terms of, he was a god that became an arsehole. And so they locked him away in a prison. It was a bit rushed.
Because, so apparently this version of Anubis is the son of Osiris, which isn't the traditional... I say traditional. There are lots of different versions of the Egyptian myths and who sired who in the Egyptian myths.
She mentions, I made a note of this, she mentions that the name, the symbol for father and creator are the same symbol, is what she says. So he created Anubis / was his father. That's what she says.
Yeah. I missed that detail actually at the time. That's a really, really interesting point. And yeah, that's fair. That's a fair interpretation. But traditionally, Osiris is the father of Horus, not Anubis.
Interesting.
But there are lots of different versions of that, and sometimes Anubis can be an older god than... It seems quite likely that Anubis is one of the oldest of the Egyptian deities and came to prominence actually before Osiris.
Because earlier on, this is another note I made. I'm going to stop saying that because I made lots of notes. Because at the very start, they're talking about Osiris, and they say he was considered by many to be the first pharaoh.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah, that's legit.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
he's by and large seen as the first pharaoh because he established the notion of kingship in the mythology and rightful kingship as well as agriculture, as she rightly notes. There's a lot of mostly good Egyptology in this, if you're looking for it. And then there's some weird kind of moments where they've gone, let's slip in some alternative archaeology, like the idea of there being an older civilization, and that this predates all of the other pyramids. And it's kind of like, well, if it was built by actual gods, fine.
Well, I think that's what they say, though, right? Because Osiris built this pyramid for his journey to the afterlife, and then Anubis got annoyed about it for some reason, and
this is what I didn't follow. Yeah.
Then he starts. He's looking for the perfect, pure soul. I'm not entirely sure why. Is that for him to get to the afterlife as well?
I think he needs a heart light enough to fit on the scale to open the gate for him to get through to the afterlife, because he can't do it himself or something.
Oh, I see.
So he can't weigh his own heart, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. So then he was killing hundreds of people, so they locked him in this pyramid.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting.
I mean, there's a precedent in a similar myth. I say similar, it's not that similar, but it's a similar precedent in the myth of Sekhmet, the lion goddess, because the lion goddess, Sekhmet, was the protector of Ra, traditionally. And Ra gets sick of humanity being a bunch of assholes. And
that's fair.
Yeah, really fair, actually, considering. And so he's like, Sekhmet, they're rebelling, they're a bunch of assholes, go down and kill a bunch of them. And so she goes down to kill a bunch of them, and then Ra's like, oh man, I shouldn't have done that. I feel bad about that. Let's call her back. But she's in a bloodlust and she won't stop killing. And she's just like tearing through the land, killing everyone, climbing in your windows, And so Thoth Tahuti is like, well, look, I got an idea. And he goes and he puts a load of food coloring into some beer, so it looks like blood. And then he pours it out and he's like, here, Sekhmet, here's a bunch of blood. You know you love blood. And she drinks it all up and gets drunk and falls asleep and forgets about killing people.
Classic.
Yeah. Right. And it's a really interesting myth because it kind of displays a bunch of things that the Egyptians thought were virtues and unvirtuous and things like that, and how cleverness is valued in the idea of Thoth Tahuti being very clever. And being one of the original kind of trickster gods in some ways, but also being this very creative, intelligent god of magic and linguistics and things like that. But anyway, so there's kind of a precedent for gods turning against humanity and having that kind of bloodlust in the record to a degree. They've just switched up the gods.
Yeah, which I guess the whole point is he's a monstrous looking thing, right?
Yeah.
And Anubis is that god. So...
Yeah. I mean, I know I've met in my time studying ancient Egyptian religions a number of people who follow Anubis. So I'm sorry if you're listening out there that's.
I'm not saying he's monstrous. I just thought it was quite an interesting take.
It is an interesting take,
but I just like turning, not even a fresh perspective necessarily, but just taking a concept and turning on its head and saying, what if this thing you thought? Thanks. What if this thing you thought was great is actually not great?
Yeah.
And we just didn't know. Yeah. And that's kind of the impression that you got in this, was not that. I mean, Anubis is obviously the bad guy, but spoilers. But they haven't gone into they don't think that. She discovers it basically. It's like it was they buried him in there and then kept it all a secret so that no one would ever know.
Yeah, it's true. Which makes me wonder about it as a twist, because it relies on you kind of knowing who Anubis is, who they only very briefly cover in passing. Kind of relies on knowing that and having that expectation for it to work as a twist in some ways. Otherwise, it's just, he's the monster.
Which is where I fell. Like, I knew Anubis was the jackal-headed god, and then for me, it was like, oh, cool, the jackal-headed god is the bad guy. That's interesting. Rather than being like, oh, this benevolent character is actually a monstrous character, I guess.
Which was my perspective. I was like, oh, they're doing Anubis a bit of a serious disservice here. Wow, bummer.
I mean, I want to be generous and say, they've got 2 levels to it, and they're turning all these things on their head. But it's probably not. Well, it probably is more just. He's got a jackal head, guys. This guy could look really gross. Let's make him the monster.
Yeah, does feel a bit that way, doesn't it? bit arbitrary in some ways.
But
But
I
this is
liked
why
it,
it's
so-
good to have these conversations with someone from a completely different perspective, you see, because you don't have my Egyptological bias. So as a filmmaker,
Yes.
what are your, in summary, what are your thoughts about this film? Would you recommend it? Do you think did they execute it well enough for you to recommend it?
I think, obviously, you're only going to watch it if you like a horror film. And
Or Egypt a lot.
enough that you can abide a horror film.
Yeah.
I'd recommend it, sure. It's not that long.
It's true. It's one of the things I said right at the end of watching it was, well, at least it was short.
Yeah, I think it's fun. I think the so, if I then start to get granular with it from a filmmaking perspective, the performances are all different and arguably, on the one hand, you could say they don't blend very well.
No, they don't. I thought the journalist felt really shonky compared to the others, and the in-betweeners dude was just the in-betweeners dude.
This is it. And Dennis O'Hare is amazing, as always.
Yeah.
But at the same time, for me, it worked. It's a B movie. You're kind of in it. And I felt, they played their characters well. I liked that he was a cowardly cameraman. I felt his sudden change at the end was a little abrupt, I thought. And, my main criticism with the making of it, I guess, would be, as you mentioned earlier, it isn't all found footage. Yeah. So, but because it's all still handheld and the camera isn't distinctly a particular style, so it hasn't got a particular camera filter to it necessarily. It's not got the clock running. It does at one moment when they're using the night vision, but throughout the whole film, it doesn't got the, what you typically see, which you wouldn't get if you were filming it. But the frame lines and the recording symbol and stuff like that. Yeah. So there are moments when it suddenly shifts to, what would you call it? An ethereal cameraman, filming them, filming things.
Yep.
And there are moments when it happens for horror elements where you see them walking down a tunnel and something will run past the camera. But I find it quite jarring because my instinctive thing is, wait, who's filming them now?
Yeah.
Who's filming this? And because it's suddenly shifted. And this isn't unheard of. District 9 does it. District 9 starts off all documentary and then slowly...
that's true, it does, doesn't it?
It just shifts and you're kind of... But it kind of then stops being documentary style.
Yeah.
Whereas this continually goes back to their different cameras.
Well, this is one of my issues with the film in general. It was that I was like, what is this trying to be? Because at certain points, it's doing a really good Tomb Raider impression or Indiana Jones impression where there's like sand traps and spike traps. And
yeah, I was going to say, when she dies, that's very much Tomb Raider.
Well, yes, when one of them dies.
Sorry, the journalist.
And there's loads of like elements of that. And then there's the kind of monster in the house. And points it's the descent, and other points it's
the descent. I made a note of that. It's not as good as the descent.
No,
I will just straight up say that. It is different, but it does a lot of the same things, which is because where it starts, its third act is quite different from the first two. Yeah. And my favorite thing about the descent is most of the terror for me is in the claustrophobia of it, which they do a lot more in the descent, not really enough in this. In this, it's just kind of, they make a point early on of saying, ancient Egyptians were only 5 feet tall.
Yes.
So be careful. But then that never really plays into what they're doing very much.
And here's a massive chamber. And here's another massive chamber.
And then
a massive chamber.
Exactly. The bits where they're crawling through some tunnels, but they're not the smallest of tunnels. Whereas in the descent, it's like their face is grinding against the wall, like they're properly, and those were all the ways the worst bits for me in the descent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's like, how the hell are you going to get out of here?
Yeah.
And it felt like they were properly trapped. Whereas in this, it feels like they just got lost. Is it because the pyramid's magic? That's why it's a labyrinthine. Are they getting turned around, or did they literally just turn left when they should have turned right?
Did they zag when they should have zagged?
Yeah. And it's not clear, but then I guess it feeds into that world building of unease.
It's funny, yeah, because there were a few things that didn't quite add up for me there. Now that you've brought that up, because there's the idea that they just got turned around, which seems valid considering they managed to figure out through logic a way out. But then those Freemasons, you see the Freemason in there who'd made the earlier tunnel that they'd used to access it.
They discover the tunnel, don't they?
Yeah.
Is that how they find the pyramid? I can't remember. But what I don't quite understand is, especially with the end, because the end suddenly then felt quite rushed.
Yeah.
Because
super rushed.
She climbs up this... Oh, yeah, that annoyed me, actually. So they have to solve a riddle, Tomb Raider style. Yeah. They have to look at the stars in the ceiling. And that was actually quite interesting. The three-sided pyramid was also the symbol for the... I think she says the Sirius star.
Which is also known as the dog star.
Is that... Oh. Jackal is a canine, which I thought tied in quite nicely with the three pyramid that they're in and stuff like that.
Yeah, I thought that was pretty sound, actually.
But they were using that, and it's like, oh, well, so the star is where we need to go, and the star's above that tunnel, so it must be that tunnel. And then literally you get there, and there's a ladder by the tunnel. It's like, well, why don't you just look and you see the
guys?
How long did it take you to solve that riddle? You could have just looked up and seen there was a ladder.
But then was that the ladder that the Egyptian commander had come down through? Was that a modern ladder that guy had used?
I got the impression that it was the Freemason.
It was the Freemason's ladder.
Because it was a ropey old rope ladder.
Well, that's not uncommon.
But then she climbs up it, and then basically she's at the exit.
Yeah.
But then if the exit is the tunnel that the Freemasons came through, did they literally just walk past that when they entered?
Yeah. They must have, mustn't they, in theory?
I mean, I'm overanalyzing it.
Well, I would like to see a map of how they...
We could get some satellite imagery of this.
Yeah. They've definitely brushed over some corners here, because that feels like a bit of a plot hole.
There was a lot of... I mean, but the thing is, it always happens with horror films. There's a lot of just convenience that happens.
Yeah.
And it's hard for me to throw that at them and because everyone does it. It's hard for me to pull that string, really.
It's true, actually. Even in the best horrors, you do see that.
And in fact...
Because reasons.
Yeah, like horror films are really hard, particularly supernatural horror films. The third act is always the hardest because it requires the most suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
Because it is, by the very nature of it, unreal. So, here you've got a giant evil Egyptian god. Just go with it, I guess. Because if you're going to start to be really nitpicking about, well, this exit was here the whole time. And then
totally.
It's like, but there's a giant monster,
Yeah. He's a bit distracting, and he may make you panic a bit and lose your way.
Yeah,
and there may be some kind of obfuscation there as well. I mean, maybe it is magic,
Yeah.
Maybe it is. Maybe that's why they couldn't get out. Maybe you had to solve the riddle. Who knows?
But I think that's the thing that was slightly... So then that is where I start to get kind of...
Feels a bit arbitrary there, doesn't it?
Well, is it one thing or the other, The pyramid was created by Osiris for him to get to immortality, but then it was turned into a prison by the human people.
Yeah.
But then, so why is it weirdly magical? Or is it even magical, Are they just panicking and getting turned around and things like that?
Why, if it's a prison, is it so easy to get out of?
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't...
That was my big question. It's like, can he come up that? Oh, he can. He can actually... He can just get out if he wants now.
But then he isn't... I guess the thing is he's not trying to leave.
What did you think of the Easter egg? Did you watch right to the end?
I did, and I didn't. I missed
so
that.
There's footage right at the end after the... Well, I have the DVD. I bought the DVD because I'm a sucker and I like to support the film industry.
Yeah.
And there's like an Easter egg right at the end of the credits where his message, where he records the message using the antenna of Shorty saying, I'm Professor Blah and I'm stuck in this pyramid. If you come down, bring guns.
Which was awesome.
And that's picked up by after the credits, and you see him on the screen and they're like in the NASA bit and they're looking at the thingy and then it cuts off. And
cool.
It felt like And I was like, these guys want to make Aliens. Because this feels like Alien.
Yeah.
It's monster in the house. There's one thing, it's picking people off. You know, you can't escape. So you got to deal with it. Although that doesn't end up being what happens. Spoiler.
I mean, it's 6 years. I think we're long past getting a sequel, but
we're long past getting a sequel. But like, it felt like they were trying to set up for some Marines to be like, you know, I want to see Hudson and Hicks busting in there as colonial Marines.
Interesting side note, but so found footage films are obviously, they're quite overplayed. And I thought, you know, that this one wasn't all found footage meant that they could do some quite interesting, it allowed them to kind of embrace horror and do the shots that they want to do. Totally. But it was confusing because, wait, who is filming them now and that kind of thing. Whereas in my humble opinion, the best found footage film, Wreck, the Spanish
I love Wreck
horror film. It's amazing.
Oh my God.
Because my biggest complaint with found footage is, why are you still filming?
Yeah.
Why are you even doing that? And kind of in this one in particular, because quite clearly when it starts, you get the impression he's just doing it out of instinct almost. He's really nervous, but he's still filming because that's what he's here to do, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then obviously it would reach a point where you just be like, okay, I'm not doing it. I get that he needs the camera because the camera has the light on.
Yep.
And the night vision. So that kind of makes sense.
It kind of makes sense. I felt
also,
like it was pretty well established in his character as well.
Yeah. And flip side, if you make it out there and you weren't filming, I'd be really pissed off at myself.
Exactly.
So I can kind of forgive that. But in Wreck, for example, there is a narrative explanation, which is, you know, we need to let people know what's going on here. This is not okay.
That's the takeaway.
So we have to film everything.
That's the takeaway here. If you're going to watch a horror movie, go watch Wreck.
Yeah.
REC. Spanish version. Don't watch the American remakes. Bollocks.
Quarantine.
Spanish version.
But interestingly, the sequel to that, they then send in a bunch of soldiers with guns.
It's true. Yes. Yes.
So,
I liked Wreck 2. I thought it was pretty good. Wreck 3 was a bloody mess. Avoid it like the plague.
But it's its own thing, right? I've not seen Wreck 3, but then they made an actual sequel, Wreck 4, on a boat.
We have gone way off tangent here. Anyway,
sorry.
So
Yes.
bringing it back. Back. Out of 10, would you recommend it?
Yeah, I would give it. It's 2020 and everything's rubbish, so I'm going to be generous and say I'm going to give it a 7.
Wow, that is super generous.
It is, because it's not really. Generous. It's probably a 5, but
I'd say it's probably a 5. But yeah, given that everything else this year is awful, I'm going to give it a 6.
Yeah,
and I would say if you like. You don't need to watch it now because we've ruined everything about it.
Yeah, we have.
Sorry about that. But if you like Tomb Raider, if you like horror movies, if you liked Alien, if you like The Descent, this is not as good as any of those. But in the absence of those...
You won't get them all at the same time.
Exactly.
You've got a lot of discipline.
Ashley Hinshaw makes quite a passable, aspiring Lara Croft, if you're into that kind of thing. So, and Dennis O'Hare is great as a curmudgeon-y old Egyptologist. So I'm here for it. I don't regret watching it.
I would say I'd rate it higher, but the theme song or the song that plays during the credits.
God, the song in the outro is bloody awful.
I don't know why they did that.
I don't know what was happening with that. That was horrendous. Someone got a deal.
In terms of Egyptology, how accurate are all the statues and carvings and stuff that are in that final tomb?
Actually, well, I don't know about the final tomb specifically because by that point I kind of switched my brain off. But a lot of the stuff on the way there was pretty good.
Okay.
Like the depictions of Osiris were good. The hieroglyphs had obviously been lifted from other tombs by the looks of it. They'd done some really good homework. The only thing I would say that was weird about it was that it's meant to be older than the Giza tombs and pyramids, and it's got actual hieroglyphs in it, which they don't. We don't see hieroglyphs inside pyramids until the 5th dynasty when they start putting the Book of the Dead on the walls.
Interesting.
But, so that's.
But then I guess thing. He talks about it being a warning, and it makes sense that they then carve warnings into the wall.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, as a horror Tomb Raider movie, I think it's fine, and I think the Egyptology in it isn't actually terrible, unlike a lot of Egyptological inspired stuff.
Well, we made a point in The Mummy of ripping that apart for its Egyptology.
Terrible Egyptology, yeah, absolutely. No, this was
because it was very much perfunctory, whereas here it felt very much part of the narrative. I was going to ask you about the digging, because it's a very frantic dig site at the very start. There's a lot of people just hacking away, and there's a lot of energy and almost rushing and that kind of stuff. Is that typical, or is that just for the movie and making it feel?
I'll tell you what, I've done some very bloody frantic archaeology in my time myself, but that's because I was working in rescue archaeology, where you have a building site worth of builders breathing down your neck, and they're like, hurry up and get on with it because we've got foundations to lay. I mean, sites are frantic. They're very busy places, but you're not going to be mattocking out a pyramid.
During the Arab Spring, you might be rushing a little bit.
During the Arab Spring, you would be rushing. That would be quite frantic, yeah.
Hey guys, let's get this done. Go, go, go.
That's absolutely true. I think that explains an awful lot about this movie. And my career. Yeah. No, that's a really good question, though. It's a really good question. And my only answer is it just varies from site to site. And a lot of research digs are really slow and painstaking and not actually that fun to watch.
Yeah, well, quite. I remember I wanted to be a paleontologist because of Jurassic Park. And then watching paleontology, and I was like, oh no, I don't have the patience for this.
Yeah.
It's an incredible skill that I don't have the patience for.
Tiny brushes, and no, it's hard work.
Interesting. There was a little Jurassic Park reference in it with the cats that attack Anubis.
Yes. Yeah, what was that about? Why are the cats turning on Anubis?
Yeah, I don't know. They don't mention it, but then because I assumed that they were part of his posse, but I guess not.
We assume that until they turn on him, and it's kind of like there's a throwaway line about Bast being one of the protectors, or cats being the protectors of the underworld, and there's a reference to Bast from that.
I found it slightly confusing because of that.
I thought it was a bit weird myself, and I couldn't understand why at all, what was going on with that. So yeah, there were definitely some moments where they just went, whatever, we'll just make this thing happen now because we don't know how to end this.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's wrap it up. So
I enjoyed it. I thought it's silly. I mean, you're watching a found footage horror film set in a pyramid. What do you expect? Pretty much this film.
And on that bombshell, thank you for listening. And we'll be back with another film analysis.
You should start with that.
Next time I'll lead with that. All right. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure, an honor and a privilege, as Tom Cruise would say. An honor and a privilege. And let's do this again sometime. Thank you all for listening, and a heartfelt thanks to my guests who take valuable time out of their days to speak with annoying podcasters like me. I also want to thank my patrons and everyone who stuck with this show through various breaks and name changes. I've closed the funding page for the show as I don't know how long the break will be, and, well, I wouldn't feel right with people sponsoring a show they won't be getting for a while. It has been a ride, and I've been able to meet and speak with so many incredible people I might not have otherwise, and it's been special. And I realise that sounds quite final, but it isn't forever, as they say, and this isn't goodbye, but merely until next time. I wish you all a wonderful summer as we, God's willing, emerge from this pandemic. Somewhat battered, but optimistic. This is Dr. Paul Harrison, and this is the Profane Podcast signing off for now. Thank you.